And it's a pleasure to present to Utah Native Plant Society, which I'm a member, although I think I have to renew here soon. And it's kind of nice seeing some familiar names and faces. So yeah, I'll get to it. I realized that in my presentation, which is really a discussion of the value of old trees in assessing past and present climate conditions, realized that old trees, ponderosa pines, in this case, in research natural areas may not be a core interest to many of you, but hope to illustrate how both trees and natural areas are broadly relevant to native plants, particularly in rapidly changing environments. And before I get into my slides, I wanted to acknowledge Mark for not only inviting me, but for allowing me to use some of his fine photos that I've used in the presentation. Also want to thank the Escalante River Watershed Partnership, and Linda Whittam and Grand Staircase Escalante Partners, Sarah Bauman, as well as the U.S. Forest Service. And I'd finally like to acknowledge Dennis Bramble, retired University of Utah professor who spearheaded the work that I'll be discussing tonight. All right, in this presentation, as a quick overview, I'll briefly discuss to me, the interesting topic of tree longevity, and relatedly, the value of annual tree rings in putting present climate conditions in a longer term context of past climate variation. And I'll talk about conditions that make tree growth sensitive to climate fluctuations. Important point. And then I'll talk a little bit about dendrochronology, which is really the study and dating of tree rings, including the techniques of cross-dating, detrending, and tree ring chronology building. Talk a little bit about long-term climate trends in the tree ring chronology that we recently constructed for Upper Sand Creek Natural Area. And then discuss those conclusions from that chronology, along with some planned future research that we plan to do at the site. And then finally, a plug for the importance of dedicated research areas on public lands. All right, well, tree longevity, or I mean, the question could also, I suppose, be posed, can trees live indefinitely? And certainly some bristlecone pine trees in California that are approaching 5,000 years old suggest that, well, if not indefinitely, they can live for very long periods of time. And there are some reasons for this. Trees have a simple, real modular body plan, and they lack the genetically programmed senescence that we see in annual plants. In fact, trees appear to succumb from external factors like structural failure, insects, rather than age-related causes. And whereas some anatomical and physiological limits to tree immortality have recently been proposed, such questions are difficult to address experimentally, in part because exceedingly old trees are rare in the landscape. And in order to design a research study, one would have to make it a multi-generational project. So the ongoing debate about whether trees can live indefinitely may never really be answered, but I find it intriguing. But nonetheless, with regards to trees, annual growth rings that we find in trees offer a long and temporally specific record of growth at a site or across a region. And Whereas ponderosa pine is not known for great longevity compared to species like, say, bristlecone pine or even pinyon pines. The oldest reported ponderosa pine is from the Wawa Mountains in southwest Utah, and Kitchens with the U.S. Forest Service in Provo found a tree that he aged with a minimum age of 933 years with a corresponding establishment date of 1075. Given and that tree is, the fuzzy picture of the tree is shown in the slide, and given the corning height of the tree, the actual age of the tree is probably at least a couple decades longer than what has been officially entered for the tree. Well, the time period that this tree existed, and for which there is a tree ring record for, it would include the intense megadrought period in the late 1200s, which caused human depopulation of the Four Corners region. So really valuable information is contained within these tree rings. And we attempted to utilize that information in developing a longer-term understanding of climate fluctuations at our site at Upper Sand Creek. And on sites like Sand Creek, with shallow water-limited soils illustrated here in this figure, a steep, shallow rooting zone underlain by rocky substrate, in this case, Navajo sandstone. Trees, the tree ring record, or the record of tree ring growth on trees growing in such locations will be sensitive to shifts in climate, especially expressions of moisture availability, like soil moisture, drought severity, indices, evaporative demand, things like that. And in such instances, we can use dendrochronology or the analysis of annual tree rings to reconstruct past climate conditions at specific sites over relatively long periods of time that would be unavailable to us otherwise. I would submit that such knowledge is relevant to understanding and anticipating how native plant populations are likely to respond to ongoing and future aridification in Utah and across the western U.S. and across the U.S. in general. Well, I'll illustrate the application of dendrochronology in our case to assess long-term climate conditions at a site by discussing ongoing work that we have at Upper Sand Creek Natural Area, which is located within Dixie National Forest near the town of Escalante. And this 1,880 acre research natural area is situated on the southern flanks of Boulder Mountain. And the forest is dominated in the upper portions, the higher elevation portions of the research area by ponderosa pine and pinyon juniper in the lower extent of the study area. Thin exposures of Cutler Formation is sort of this darker green color here, overlying Navajo sandstone here, and create the climate sensitive site conditions that I mentioned and showed a picture of previously. So the use of tree rings in climate reconstructions requires the extraction of tree cores from a relatively large number of trees using an increment borer, as Dennis Bramble is demonstrating here at the Upper Sand Creek site. Cores, we typically wipe the increment borer down with alcohol prior to inserting the core into the tree. And then we remove the cores, place them in straws, dry them, mount them on wooden blocks, and sand them to better visualize the annual rings. So a bit of a tedious process there, but not nearly as tedious as counting the rings, which can take a really long time. And illustrated here, this is a portion of one of our rings from the site. And again, dendrochronology is the study and the dating of annual rings, which requires identification and counting. And you can see here, we've identified some missing rings. Ponderosa pine is notorious for not forming rings in years that are particularly stressful, particularly low precipitation years. There are also marker rings, which are generally very small, narrow rings, which are used in as identifiers for cross dating, which I'll talk about, illustrate in a second. And then once all of the rings have been assessed, then we assign a year to a specific ring. And you can see we marked, it's very typical to mark decadal periods on the core as well. So the idea of cross dating again is to ensure the proper assignment of a single calendar year to a year in which a specific ring was formed. And in order to do that, you need a number of cores, and you need to match ring widths using the marker years in order to across a number of tree cores, as illustrated here. Tree 1, tree 2, two different cores from two different trees. You can see these lines connect this is the cross dating. We're matching the matching rings of these two trees. And you can see that, they look a little different from tree to tree, but because of the particular pattern of narrow rings or marker rings, they allow for usually successful cross dating. So again, then we use this then to build a tree ring chronology, which is essentially a time sequence constructed by counting and cross-dating ring widths from many trees at a site or across a region. And cross-dating is also very useful in that it allows us to extend chronologies back in time by utilizing dead material at a site. And so in this way, as illustrated here, live and dead trees, providing they were both alive for a corresponding period of time, could be used to extend the chronology, in some cases back several thousand years at some sites. So just a quick illustration of that. Here's a living tree. We've got some marker rings here that we know the dates for. We find a standing dead tree nearby, and we are able to cross date to that standing dead tree. And that standing dead tree, again, with some distinctive marker rings, allows us to cross date to a yet older fallen dead tree, and thus extend the time sequence or the chronology back in time at a site. And in fact, trees at Upper Sand Creek were used in just that way to extend our chronology at that site back in time. All right, well, here are the raw ring widths in millimeters, plotted in what's called a spaghetti plot. for the Upper Sand Creek. Our chronology included 56 tree ring series, the oldest tree of which dated back to 1481. And here's the actual marked up core from that tree. Here is a picture of that tree, still very healthy and vigorous, again on a very shallow soil site, perched on Navajo sandstone. And I'll point out that whereas you can see in the individual raw ring widths plotted here, there is considerable variability in the growth patterns across trees, but there are some very distinct periods in which all of the trees appear to be responding in a similar way. For example, this period of increased growth is indicated by the arrow across most of the trees in the early 1900s. This is very clearly a climate signal, which we look to extract from the tree ring chronology. And I'll illustrate how these climate signals are extracted. We extract them using a technique called detrending. And climate signals in the growth of a tree are often obscured by systematic trends in growth, like age-related growth trends or differences in soil conditions or insect outbreaks that affect some trees within a stand and not others. And for example, the age-related growth trend is illustrated quite nicely here using a slab from a ponderosa pine. And what you can see here is that near the center of the tree, a young tree, small young tree, tends to grow. The rings tend to be much larger on a small tree than simply because the wood is being laid down around a much smaller circumference. As the tree gets older and larger, the ring widths sort of systematically decrease in width. This systematic growth trend we want to remove from the growth record in order to isolate any kind of climate trends that we're seeing in growth. And one way of eliminating age-related growth trends, which is common across almost all tree ring series, a negative exponential curve is used, and it is fit to the raw ring widths. And the exponential curve is illustrated here in red, and the dark line represents the raw ring widths. And in this top panel. And so what happens next then is that the raw ring width, God, I have a hard time saying that. Each ring width is divided by the corresponding value of the exponential curve. And in doing that, the numbers that result produce a ring width index, which is illustrated in the lower panel, where the growth trend has been removed. And now suddenly you see, rather than showing this age-related decrease in ring width, you have a much flatter distribution of ring widths for the series. You can then fit a smooth curve to the growth index or the ring width index, and you see what results are typically characteristics of longer term growth trends related to shifts in climate. Okay, so we took our 56 tree growth records, detrended each of those records, and shown here is the detrending curves. We use 6 detrending curves for all of our trees. This represents the raw ring width series for tree 7A and the 6 corresponding detrending curves. And we chose, because it appeared to render the best detrend, the negative exponential curve. And you can see then the resulting detrended growth pattern for that particular tree here. Well, we next did, after we detrended all 56 growth records, we averaged them together to produce a final detrended tree ring chronology for our site, which is illustrated here. So here's the standardized tree ring chronology for Upper Sand Creek. And let me spend a little time interpreting what we're seeing here. So again, the gray line here, which is jumping around up and down from what would be the average average ring width for the series, for the index, for the period of record. And again, we had a couple trees that dated back to the late 1400s. So that's the extent of our record at the site at this point. The arrows here indicate the onset, and you can see this in the record, of 2 megadrought periods, known megadrought periods for the region as described elsewhere. Megadrought from 1564 to 1600, megadrought 1866 to 1892. Again, megadroughts are defined as drought conditions that persist for more than 2 decades. So our record is showing known regional megadroughts. And we can look at that. And then we've also fitted a moving average curve, which basically smooths out all the variability in the curve, but follows the trend of the ring index data. This moving average curve, or spline, shows the long-term average, and these tend to reflect long-term climate fluctuations. What you can see here is that comparing the 2 megadrought periods, the current drought, as indicated here, has produced the largest drop in growth at the site for the entire period of record. And it begins with 2 shorter drought periods, known drought periods in the 1930s and again in the 1950s. But in particular, so recent years throughout the 2000s have continued to drive the decrease in growth at the site, reflecting ongoing drought conditions. Now, droughts are typically thought of as, and historically have been characterized by periods of severe precipitation deficit. But researchers have noted recently that significant decreased runoff and stream flow from work within the Colorado River Basin are associated with increased regional temperatures, leading to what is referred to as hot drought or aridification. Again, driven more by increasing temperatures than by lack of precipitation per se. And to illustrate the effect of these rising, or the fact of these rising temperatures at Upper Sand Creek, we downloaded data from a website that provides long-term precipitation records. In this case, from 1901 to 2000 for our site, or very close to our site. And what this data then looks at is that it takes the long-term average mean annual temperature for this period and then plots each year against that long-term average. And what you can see here is that beginning in 1975, there's been a steady increase in mean annual temperature for our site. So the hot drought effect is certainly in play at Upper Sand Creek, and I would argue across the region as well. So with that, I'll conclude with some following points. The first, the site chronology for Upper Sand Creek records quite accurately, I feel, the records, and records the presence of two previously known mega droughts, which persisted for more than 2 decades. The current downward trend in tree growth is the most pronounced in the reconstructed climate record at the site, and likely results from a combination of the 2 shorter droughts that occurred in the 30s and the 50s, increased regional warming that began at Upper Sand Creek in the mid-1970s, persistent and ongoing drought initiated in about year 2000. And we appear to be entering or have entered a mega drought at Upper Sand Creek. So it will be interesting to see going forward how vegetation at the site and other natural resources respond to ongoing drought if this current mega drought persists. All right, well, for the future, we plan to relate our site tree ring chronology, and that again is trees are very responsive. Tree rings are very responsive here to moisture deficits. So we would like to explore relationships between our tree ring chronology and climate data, such as soil moisture, and say the Palmer Drought Severity Index. We would also like to install or plan to install weather monitoring equipment, including soil moisture probes, so that we'll get real-time comparisons between ring formations and soil moisture. And we also plan to monitor vegetation conditions at the site going forward to look for any climate-related shifts in vegetation condition. And then finally, we're hoping to extend the site chronology even further back in time by coring what appear to be some very old pinyon pines at the site, but that will await a future time. All right, so let me conclude by putting in a plug for the importance of research natural areas on Forest Service land and areas of critical environmental concern on BLM lands. But nonetheless, research sites, dedicated research sites on public lands. These areas, as I hope we've illustrated here, provide research sites for understanding important physical and biological processes. And by their nature, these sites as designated represent relatively undisturbed ecological conditions. But at present, at least in Utah, these sites are relatively few in number and small in size. So in my opinion, we really need more larger units like Upper Sand Creek. New research natural areas and areas of critical environmental concern are being proposed by conservation groups for establishment at Mountain Sal National Forest, as well as Granite Staircase Escalante National Monument. All right, and with that, I thank you and would be most happy to answer any questions that you might have.